The fluorescent lights of the downtown transit terminal did not buzz. They hummed a low, vibrating drone that seemed to settle directly into the marrow of her bones. At 70, she had learned that the worst part of losing everything wasn't the cold, nor was it the hunger. It was the absolute crushing weight of invisibility. People did not look at her. They looked through her, adjusting their trajectories to bypass her bench as if she were merely an inconvenient structural pillar draped in a faded wool coat. Beneath her thin, calloused hands lay her entire existence, contained entirely within 2 heavy canvas grocery bags. The straps were frayed, reinforced with silver duct tape at the stress points. Inside were 3 changes of clothes, a plastic container holding half a sleeve of stale saltines, a pair of worn-out walking shoes, and a plastic folder protecting her birth certificate and social security card. That folder was her anchor to the grid, the only proof that she still existed in a world that had long since moved on without her. The terminal clock clicked forward with a heavy, mechanical thud. 11:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, the transit security guards would begin their nightly sweep, clearing the benches of overnight drifters. She knew the routine by heart. She would pick up her bags, step out into the sharp, damp autumn air, and begin the slow 2-mile walk toward the municipal shelter on the north side. Her knees throbbed in anticipation of the concrete, a dull, aching reminder of 7 decades of hard work that had somehow added up to a zero balance. She closed her eyes, letting her chin sink into the collar of her coat. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford in public, but she could steal moments of stillness. She remembered a time when her life had a rhythm determined by alarm clocks, grocery lists, and utility bills. Then came the layoffs, the medical debt, the sudden eviction, and finally, the slow slide down a slope so slippery she never found a handhold to stop her descent. Now, her life was measured in 12-hour increments, finding a safe place for the day, finding a warm place for the night. The sharp click of approaching boots broke her reverie. She didn't look up, expecting the usual stern request to move along. Instead, the boots stopped directly in front of her bench. A young man in a dark blue windbreaker stood there. He wasn't a security guard. He was a night shift caseworker from the outreach program where she occasionally checked in for mail and hot soup. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped from a long shift of navigating the city's margins, but his eyes were focused entirely on her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a long, crisp white envelope. It was a certified letter. The bright pink certified mail sticker slashed across the front looked jarringly official against the gray, grime-streaked background of the transit station. He explained quietly that the letter had arrived at the central shelter 3 days ago. It had required a signature, which the director had provided on her behalf through their transitional mail program. He had spent his evening tracking her down along her usual route because the return address was a prominent legal firm uptown, and the exterior of the envelope was stamped with the word urgent. She accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the heavy paper stock. The weight of it felt substantial, an anomaly in her world of flimsy plastic bags and disposable napkins. The caseworker offered a brief, encouraging smile, patted her shoulder, and walked back toward the exit, his boots clicking away, until the sound was swallowed by the terminal's ambient hum. She sat alone with the letter in her lap for a long time. In her experience, unexpected mail from a law firm never brought good news. It usually meant a debt collected, a fine levied, or a final notice of something lost. With slow, deliberate movements, she slid a thumb under the sealed flap, tearing the thick paper with a sharp, clean rip. She unfolded the parchment inside. The typography was elegant, the language formal and precise, written in the dense, unyielding style of American probate law. She read the words twice, her eyes tracking the elegant font under the harsh fluorescent glare. The letter informed her that a distant relative, a cousin she hadn't seen since a tense family funeral 30 years ago, a man who had lived a reclusive, eccentric life on the industrial edge of the county, had passed away. He had died intestate, leaving no immediate heirs, no real estate, and no liquid assets. The estate had been cleared through probate, his few remaining possessions liquidated to satisfy outstanding debts, except for one single item. According to the legal decree, she was the sole designated beneficiary of a specific asset, the contents of a single, sealed storage unit located at a commercial facility near the old shipyards. The letter explicitly stated that the executor of the estate had used the very last of the deceased's funds to prepay the back rent and fees on the unit for exactly 30 days. The clock was already ticking. The facility management had been notified, and the unit was cleared for her entry, provided she produced the letter and proper identification. If she did not claim the contents or take over the monthly lease before the 30 days expired, the entire unit would be declared abandoned, its lock cut, and the contents thrown into a commercial dumpster or sold at a public auction to the highest bidder. The letter closed with a brief inventory description provided by the storage facility manager during the initial probate assessment. The description was short, dismissive, and utterly devoid of hope. It read simply, "Contents consist entirely of unsorted industrial scrap metal and mixed mechanical waste. Estimated commercial value, negligible." She stared at the word negligible. It felt like a mirror reflecting her own current status in the world. Yet, as the terminal security guards finally entered through the far doors, their flashlights bouncing off the tiled floor, she looked down at her canvas bags, then back at the legal document in her hands. She had no money, no home, and no prospects. But as of 5 minutes ago, for the first time in 3 years, she had a destination. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into her plastic folder alongside her birth certificate, and stood up. She lifted her 2 heavy bags, turned away from the shelter route, and began walking toward the industrial district. The industrial outskirts of the city offered no shelter from the damp dawn air. By the time she reached the perimeter fence of the storage facility, the sky had bruised into a dull, asphalt gray. The facility itself looked less like a business and more like a graveyard for dead enterprises, surrounded by 10-foot chain-link fencing topped with rusted coils of razor wire. Gravel crunched beneath her worn shoes as she navigated the potholes leading toward the front office, a low-slung cinder-block building with yellowed linoleum floors and a barred window. She carried her 2 canvas bags with a quiet, rigid posture, refusing to let her shoulders slump despite the grueling all-night trek. Her dignity was the one currency she had left, and she refused to spend it here. Inside the office, a sour smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hung heavy in the air. The facility manager sat behind a scarred wooden desk, his eyes glued to a flickering television screen until she cleared her throat. When he looked up, his expression immediately hardened into the universal glare reserved for the destitute. He saw the frayed straps of her bags, the salt and pepper hair tucked tightly beneath her collar, and the faded wool coat. He was already preparing his eviction speech before she even spoke. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out the pristine plastic folder, and placed the certified legal letter squarely on the counter. Beside it, she laid her social security card and her birth certificate. The manager blinked, his cynical gaze shifting from the documents to her calm, unblinking eyes. He picked up the letter, his rough thumb smudging the crisp white paper as he scanned the legal jargon and the specific unit number. 412. He grunted, checked her ID against the probate paperwork, and reached for a heavy ring of master keys hanging from a pegboard behind him. He didn't apologize for his initial judgment, but his attitude shifted from hostile to indifferent. He walked out from behind the counter, gesturing for her to follow him into the maze of corrugated steel walls. The facility was an endless grid of identical, oil-stained alleys. The morning fog clung to the metal siding of the units, making the entire place feel cold and detached from the living world. They walked deep into the rear grid, past units that echoed with emptiness, until they stopped in front of a rusted roll-up door tucked into the farthest, darkest corner of the lot. The numbers 412 were faintly visible, painted in faded stenciled black that had begun to peel and flake away. A massive, heavily weathered padlock secured the bottom latch, its brass body oxidized into a chalky green. The manager didn't bother trying a key on the old lock. Instead, he reached into a plastic bin near the alleyway post and pulled out a heavy pair of long-handled bolt cutters. He braced his boots against the concrete, positioned the hardened steel jaws over the padlock's shackle, and threw his weight into the handles. A sharp, metallic crack echoed through the silent alley as the lock snapped in two. He tossed the broken pieces into the gravel, unlatched the heavy sliding bar, and grabbed the dented handle at the bottom of the door. With a violent, screeching rattle that set her teeth on edge, he hoisted the door upward, slamming it into the ceiling track. A thick cloud of stagnant, metallic dust billowed out of the darkness, making her cough and shield her eyes with a frail hand. As the air cleared under the weak morning sun, the reality of her inheritance stood fully exposed. It looked like a cruel, calculated joke. The 10 by 20-foot space was packed solid, from the cracked concrete floor straight up to the corrugated ceiling, with a mountain of literal junk. There were no neatly stacked boxes, no wrapped furniture, no sentimental trunks of old photographs. Instead, a chaotic wall of industrial debris loomed over her. Twisted, green patinaed copper pipes snaked through the pile like skeletal remains. Rusted iron gears the size of truck tires pressed against the metal side walls. There were shattered housings of unidentifiable machinery, piles of jagged zinc plates, and heaps of heavy steel cables that had frayed into dangerous, needle-sharp nests. Everything was covered in a thick, velvety layer of gray dust that had settled over decades of absolute abandonment. The manager let out a dry, mocking laugh that cut through her like a blade. He leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head as he looked at the wreckage. He told her plainly that the scrapyard down the boulevard wouldn't even pay for the gas it would take to haul this mess away, especially with the cost of sorting the iron from the contaminated zinc. He reminded her with a casual callousness that she had exactly 30 days to clear every single piece of this garbage out of his unit, or he would charge her a heavy disposal fee she obviously couldn't pay before throwing it all into the industrial compactor out back. She didn't answer him. She couldn't. She stood frozen on the threshold, the weight of her exhaustion finally catching up to her. The legal letter in her pocket suddenly felt like a lead weight. For a few brief hours in the transit station, she had allowed herself to imagine a different outcome. She had dreamed of a hidden bank account, a box of old bonds, or even just a collection of vintage furniture she could sell to secure a small, warm apartment for the winter. Instead, her estranged relative had left her a tomb of worthless, heavy iron. The manager turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy boots echoing down the alley until the sound faded completely, leaving her entirely alone in the gray morning light. The wind picked up, whistling sharply through the gaps in the corrugated steel roof above her. She looked at her 2 canvas bags resting on the gravel, then looked back at the towering pile of jagged, rusted metal. Her hands were trembling, but she tightened her jaw and took a single step forward, crossing the threshold into the dust. The heavy scent of oxidized iron and stagnant dust became her air. When the sun climbed high enough to bake the corrugated metal roof, the interior of Unit 412 turned into a suffocating kiln, but she did not leave. She had nowhere else to go. With a slow, deliberate grace that defied her aching joints, she hauled her 2 canvas bags deep into the narrow gap between the mountain of scrap and the far left wall. The manager's threat of eviction hung over her like a guillotine, but she quickly realized the chaotic topography of the junk was her greatest asset. By pulling down a tangled web of rusted steel cables and wedging a massive, dented iron boilerplate at an angle, she created a blind spot, a hidden alcove at the very back of the unit that was completely invisible from the entrance. Within this narrow sanctuary, she constructed a makeshift bed. She flattened her sturdiest cardboard boxes across the cold concrete to block the rising dampness, then layered her spare clothing over the top to create a thin mattress. Her folded wool coat served as a pillow. It was a meager setup, but as she sat down in the shadows, hidden from the predatory gaze of the security cameras and the manager's rounds, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation wash over her. For the first time in 3 years, she was behind a closed door. She could pull the rusted roller door down to a slit at the bottom, lock herself inside the dark maze, and sleep without the terror of a transit guard's flashlight shocking her awake. The junk, which had felt like a cruel joke hours before, had become her fortress. Survival, however, demanded more than shelter. By the second morning, the stale saltines in her bag were gone, and the gnawing ache in her stomach forced her to work. She possessed no tools, no gloves, and no experience in industrial salvage, but she had an abundance of time and a desperate need to eat. She approached the front face of the mountain with caution, her bare fingers testing the jagged edges of the debris. She focused on the smaller, manageable pieces first, twisted lengths of copper piping that had oxidized into a vibrant turquoise, and heavy brass fittings that felt solid and cold in her palms. She began sorting the materials by color and weight, piling the non-ferrous metals into her empty canvas bags. She knew from her years on the streets that copper and brass held value at the local scrapyards, unlike the worthless, rusted iron that made up the bulk of the unit. Every lift was a battle against her own physical limitations. The sharp edges of the metal sliced through the skin of her palms, leaving dark smudges of rust and dried blood, but she didn't stop. The rhythm of the labor gave her a purpose, a structure to days that had previously been defined by aimless wandering. By mid-afternoon, she had managed to fill one bag with clean copper tubing. She carried it 2 miles down the industrial boulevard to a salvage yard, her muscles burning under the unyielding weight. The clerk behind the wire mesh paid her $14 in crumpled ones and loose change, a pittance for the physical toll it had taken, but enough to buy a hot container of soup and a fresh gallon of water at a corner bodega. When she returned to Unit 412, she felt a renewed sense of focus. She ate her meal in the quiet safety of her alcove, then immediately returned to the pile. Now that the loose, superficial layers of copper had been stripped away, she began to confront the larger, heavier pieces of iron that blocked her path. She wedged a broken length of steel pipe beneath a massive, rusted engine housing, using it as a crude lever to pry the heavy casting loose. With a grinding screech, the iron shifted, toppling forward into the gravel alleyway just outside the door. She wiped the sweat and grime from her forehead with her sleeve, leaning against the side wall to catch her breath. She looked back at the gap she had just created in the pile, expecting to see more of the same chaotic, disorganized debris. Instead, her eyes narrowed as she noticed something strange about the way the next layer of metal was positioned. The chaos vanished. The deeper she dug, the more the random arrangement of junk began to look structured, even calculated. The remaining heavy iron plates, rusted steel gears, and industrial machinery parts were not piled haphazardly as if dumped from the back of a truck. They were meticulously stacked, interlocking with one another like the massive stone blocks of a fortress wall. Every heavy piece was braced against another, creating a deliberate, stable barrier that spanned the entire width of the unit from floor to ceiling. It was too precise, too uniform to be accidental. Her breath hitched in her throat as she realized the truth. This wasn't a random collection of worthless scrap metal. The front half of the storage unit had been intentionally engineered as a barricade. Someone had gone to immense physical lengths to build a heavy, impenetrable wall of junk, using the illusion of worthless industrial waste to shield whatever lay behind the back of the unit from a casual glance or a probate appraisal. She stepped closer to the interlocked structure, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her face near a small crevice where 2 massive iron plates met, trying to peer through the gloom into the dark space beyond the barricade. She couldn't see anything through the density of the metal, but as she inhaled sharply, she didn't smell the sharp, acidic tang of rust that dominated the front of the unit. Instead, escaping through the tiny crack in the wall, came the faint, unmistakable scent of aged canvas, clean lubricating oil, and heavy, sealed timber. The shadow fell across the threshold of Unit 412 before she heard his footsteps. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, her small, blood-smudged hands instinctively clamping over the handles of her canvas bags. Standing in the gravel alleyway was a towering figure framed by the harsh midday sun. He wore oil-stained canvas work pants, heavy steel-toed boots, and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with the muscle of a lifetime of hard labor. A battered flatbed truck, its bed loaded with neat stacks of salvaged iron, sat idling a few yards down the lane. He was a local scrapper, one of the quiet regulars who combed the industrial district for survival, moving through the facility with the silent authority of someone who knew the exact weight and value of the world's discarded things. He didn't speak right away. His eyes, sharp and calculating beneath the brim of a grease-stained baseball cap, traveled from the neat piles of sorted copper at her feet to the massive, interlocking wall of iron she had spent the afternoon fighting. He saw her trembling knees, the sweat cutting tracks through the gray dust on her face, and the sheer defiance in her posture. He knew the manager's reputation, and he knew exactly what a 70-year-old woman living out of bags in a dead-end storage unit meant. Instead of calling security or offering empty pity, He simply walked to the back of his truck, retrieved a pair of heavy leather work gloves, and tossed them gently onto her makeshift cardboard bed. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble that matched the mechanical hum of the neighborhood. He remarked that she was moving iron the hard way, and that a lever was only as good as the anchor behind it. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped into the cramped, suffocating heat of the unit, his massive frame instantly making the space feel smaller. He bypassed her hidden alcove with a respectful, deliberate turn of his head, focusing entirely on the structural puzzle of the metal wall. She watched him with cautious curiosity. He didn't handle the metal with the frantic energy of a thief. He moved with a slow, rhythmic efficiency. He slipped a heavy steel crowbar from his belt under a jammed iron housing, applied his weight, and guided the 300-pound casting down to the concrete with a dull, controlled thud. He was testing the wall, reading the interlocking logic of the scrap just as she had, his brow furrowing as he realized the pieces weren't just dumped there, they were woven together. For 2 hours they worked in a silent, unspoken partnership. She pointed out the smaller locking pins and cleared away the loose debris, while he provided the raw physical leverage needed to dismantle the barrier. The air grew thick with flying dust, and the sharp, hot smell of friction. With every massive piece he pried loose and rolled into the alley, the scent of old canvas and industrial oil grew stronger, seeping through the widening gaps in the wall. He smelled it too. His movements slowed, his expression shifting from casual assistance to intense, professional curiosity. He wasn't just helping a neighbor anymore, he was unearthing a secret. Finally, they reached the core of the barricade. Blocking the remaining path was a massive rectangular steel plate, easily 4 inches thick and weighing more than both of them combined. It was braced vertically against the side walls, acting as the final, impenetrable vault door of the structure. He examined the edges, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the gravel, and looked at her. He muttered that whatever was behind this plate, someone had gone to hell and back to make sure nobody ever found it by accident. He went to his truck and returned with a heavy-duty hydraulic bottle jack and a length of solid oak timber. He wedged the jack against the opposite concrete wall, placed the timber against the steel plate, and began to pump the handle. The metal groaned, a terrifying high-pitched shriek of protesting iron that echoed off the corrugated ceiling. She held her breath, backing into the alley as the immense pressure built. With a sudden, explosive bang, the steel plate shifted, losing its footing and tilting forward. He caught the top edge with his gloved hands, his boots skidding across the grit as he channeled the massive weight, guiding it down flat against the floor. As the dust settled from the impact, both of them stood frozen, staring into the newly exposed rear third of the storage unit. The chaotic mess of the scrapyard ended abruptly at the boundary of that steel plate. Behind it lay a pristine, shadowy chamber, completely sealed from the elements. Resting squarely in the center of the clean concrete floor sat a massive, military-grade wooden crate. It was constructed from thick, dark heart pine boards reinforced with heavy steel bands along the corners. Unlike everything else in the facility, there was not a single speck of gray dust coating its surface. The wood looked as fresh and treated as the day it had been sealed decades ago, preserved perfectly by the airtight barrier of the metal wall. She took a slow step forward, her breath catching in her throat. He followed her, his heavy boots making no sound on the clean floor. At the front of the crate, dead center where the steel bands met, was a heavy, industrial-grade combination lock machined from solid chrome. It was a specialized, unpicked mechanism, its tumbler dials gleaming under the weak light stretching from the doorway. There were no scratch marks around the dial, no signs of forced entry, and no rust on its moving parts. It sat there like a silent sentinel, guarding a forgotten legacy that had survived the passage of time, the greed of landlords, and the collapse of a family. He reached out, his leather glove hovering just inches from the gleaming chrome dial, before he dropped his hand and looked at her, waiting for the old woman to claim what was hers. The silence inside the newly opened chamber was heavy, almost reverent, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the truck engine cooling down in the alley. They stood side by side, staring at the gleaming chrome lock, a mismatched pair bound together by an unearned secret. He did not press her for answers. nor did he suggest cutting the lock with an angle grinder from his truck. He understood, with the quiet intuition of a man who dealt in the discarded fragments of other people's lives, that some barriers demanded respect. She felt a profound wave of gratitude for his restraint. In a world that had stripped her of every boundary, his deference to her ownership felt like the first real shelter she had found in years. While he returned to his truck to fetch a set of precision calipers, a wire brush, and a can of penetrating lubricant, she returned to the hidden alcove at the back of the unit. Her mind was racing, sparking with a memory she had buried decades ago. She began to sift through the smaller items she had pulled from the front of the pile earlier that morning. Tucked inside a rusted metal fishing tackle box that she had initially dismissed as trash, she found what she was looking for. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, its cover stained with machine oil and water damage, its pages warped into stiff, brittle waves. This was her relative's journal, a chaotic logbook of formulas, blueprint sketches, and dates spanning the late 1950s through the mid-1970s. She brought the ledger out into the light, sitting cross-legged on the clean concrete floor near the wooden crate. He knelt beside her, the scent of his wood smoke and grease cologne mingling with the vintage paper smell of the book. His massive fingers handled the fragile pages with surprising tenderness as she turned them, searching for a clue. The journal was filled with dense, manic streams of technical jargon, references to metallurgical compositions, and angry rants about government contracts canceled without explanation. It was the record of a brilliant, paranoid mind that had felt the world closing in. As he sprayed a light mist of lubricant into the chrome mechanism of the lock, working the heavy dial back and forth to clear any internal grit, she focused on the very last page of the ledger. The final entry was dated October 14, 1974. Unlike the rest of the book, which was filled with flowing cursive, the final page contained only a single, frantic paragraph detailing an eviction notice from a laboratory facility. But along the vertical margin of the back cover, scratched so deeply into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through, was a series of 4 double-digit numbers, interspersed with cryptic directional arrows: 22R, 11L, 49R, 05L. Beneath the numbers, a single phrase was written in shaky block letters: "The lunar anchor." She tapped her cracked fingernail against the faded ink, showing it to him. He wiped his greasy palms on a rag, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sequence. He nodded once, a grim, focused expression settling over his features. He explained that this wasn't a standard commercial combination lock. It was a high-security tactical vault lock, the kind used by defense contractors during the Cold War. If they missed a single digit or spun the dial too quickly, the internal pins would drop into a permanent lockout state, rendering the vault unopenable without a thermal lance. The air in the unit grew thick, the heat rising as he positioned himself directly in front of the chrome dial. He closed his eyes for a second, clearing his mind, then pressed his ear close to the cold metal body of the lock. He needed to feel the mechanical feedback, to listen for the faint, microscopic clicks of the internal tumblers aligning. She held her breath, the ancient ledger clutched tightly against her chest like a shield, her gaze locked on his hands. His thick, calloused thumb and forefinger gripped the dial with absolute precision. He began the sequence, spinning the chrome wheel past 0 3 times to clear the internal chambers before stopping exactly on 22. Click. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the vault it sounded like a pistol shot. He paused, letting his breath out slowly through his nose, then began the counterclockwise rotation toward 11. She watched the sweat bead on his forehead, tracking the intensity in his eyes. This man had no stake in her inheritance, no legal claim to whatever wealth or ruin lay inside the wood, yet he was pouring his entire soul into the turning of a wheel. They were no longer just a homeless woman and a wandering scrapper. They were partners on the edge of a revelation. He passed 22, passed 0, and settled the dial precisely on 11. A second, deeper click vibrated through the chrome housing. He didn't smile. He kept his focus absolute, his hands steady as he reversed direction, spinning the wheel to 49. The tension in the room was palpable, a suffocating pressure that seemed to distort the very air around them. The dial stopped on 49. A heavy metallic thud echoed from within the mechanism as the third tumbler dropped into place. Only one number remained, 05L. He looked at her over his shoulder, his eyes silently asking her if she was ready. She nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He turned the dial slowly, a fraction of an inch at a time, counterclockwise toward the final digit. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the exact mark of 5, a loud, violent clunk shattered the silence. The heavy chrome locking bar dropped automatically, its handles spinning free. The lock had cleared. He stepped back, wiping his brow with the back of his arm, leaving a dark streak of grease across his forehead. He gestured toward the handle, yielding the moment to her. She stood up on trembling legs, her joints popping in the quiet room. She approached the massive wooden crate, her small hands gripping the heavy steel latch bar. With a deep breath, she threw her weight upward. The latch released with a heavy, satisfying metallic slap. He stepped forward to help her with the weight of the lid. Together, they pried the thick, tongue-and-groove heart pine top upward. The ancient hinges groaned in protest, a long, screeching wail of wood and iron that had been denied movement for over half a century. As the heavy lid creaked back, resting against the wall behind it, a pristine, intoxicating scent of premium lubricating oil, preserved canvas, and industrial cosmoline flooded the storage unit, sweeping away the smell of rust and despair forever. The vapor that rose from the open crate was a time capsule of the American century. It smelled of high-grade petroleum, vulcanized rubber, and the sharp, chemical tang of preserved parchment. As the thin mist dissipated into the dim light of the storage unit, she looked down, expecting the cold glitter of silver coins or the soft, rotting green of old currency. Instead, her eyes met a sea of deep midnight blue. The crate was lined with thick, quilted industrial canvas, dyed a dark navy, tailored to fit the interior with military precision. Nestled within these custom-sewn pockets were rows of heavy, cylindrical canisters machined from solid, non-magnetic titanium, each one sealed with an airtight rubber gasket and a stamped lead inspection tag. He leaned over the edge of the wood, his breath caught in his throat, his baseball cap tilting back as his eyes adjusted to the sight. He reached down with his gloved hands, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then carefully lifted the largest titanium cylinder from its cradle. The metal caught the weak sunlight streaming through the alley, its matte gray surface entirely free of the corrosion that had eaten the rest of the unit. He unscrewed the heavy top cap, the threads moving with a smooth, silent fluidity that spoke of flawless engineering. With a slow, reverent motion, he slid the contents out onto the navy canvas. It was a mechanical component, roughly the size of a loaf of bread, but machined with a complexity that made it look almost organic. Rows of microscopic, hand-polished turbine blades spun around a central shaft at the slightest nudge of his thumb, moving without a single vibration or sound. The alloy was a brilliant, unblemished silver white, engraved near the base with a serial number and a tiny, stamped logo. A stylized rocket breaking through a stylized terrestrial orbit. Beneath the canisters, stored in a vertical slot along the back wall of the crate, lay a heavy leather tube. She reached in, her slender, wrinkled fingers pulling the tube free. She popped the wax-sealed cap and extracted a thick roll of heavy, linen-backed paper. When she unrolled it across the top of the wooden lid, the deep Prussian blue of vintage engineering blueprints filled her vision. The white lines were drawn with an exquisite, hand-inked sharpness that modern computers could never replicate. In the bottom right corner, inside the official contractor block, were the words, Project Apollo, Lunar Module Navigation System Alternative. The date stamped beside it was February 18, 1966. He let out a low, breathless whistle that was almost a whisper. He dropped his gloves onto the floor, his bare, calloused fingertips tracing the white lines of the schematics with a delicate touch that bordered on worship. He didn't see junk. He didn't even see generic scrap metal. He was a man who spent his life studying the anatomy of American manufacturing, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fierce urgency, and told her that this wasn't just old machinery. These were the lost prototypes of the mid-century space race. He explained, his voice shaking slightly as he pointed to the technical notes in the margins, that during the height of the Cold War, The government had funded competing private laboratories to design backup navigation systems in case the primary NASA contracts failed. When the Apollo program succeeded using the primary designs, these alternative laboratories were ordered to destroy their prototypes, shred their blueprints, and liquidate their assets to keep the technology out of foreign hands. Her relative hadn't just been an eccentric recluse. He had been a rogue engineer who refused to let his life's work be erased by a bureaucratic decree. He had stolen his own creations, built a fortress of worthless iron to hide them from government auditors, and taken the combination to his grave. The true value, he told her, lay not in the weight of the titanium or the silver alloys, but in the patents and the historical purity of the artifacts. For decades, aerospace historians, private space exploration corporations, and national museums had written academic papers about the lost Apollo alternatives designs that were rumored to have solved the catastrophic heat synchronization issues that modern engineering firms were still trying to fix with expensive software. These components were the missing link in American aerospace history, fully realized, perfectly preserved, and entirely undocumented by any modern registry. She stood frozen, listening to the passion in his voice, the reality of her situation slowly shifting beneath her feet like tectonic plates. The world that had discarded her as a 70-year-old non-entity was a world built on the backs of machines exactly like the one resting on the canvas. She looked at her rough, blistered hands, then at the elegant, timeless geometry of the blueprints. Her relative hadn't left her a pile of trash to clear before an eviction notice expired. He had left her a key to the vaults of history. He carefully rolled the linen blueprints back into the leather tube, his movements deliberate and protective. He turned to her, his posture straightening as he took on the role of a guardian. He warned her that the moment the world outside this alley found out what was inside Unit 412, the facility manager, the city scrap dealers, and corporate lawyers would descend like vultures to find a loophole in her probate paperwork. He told her they needed to close the door, lock the unit, and find someone who could protect her interests before anyone else caught a glimpse of the blue paper. He stepped back, allowing her to pull the heavy pine lid down, the ancient wood sealing the treasures back into the dark as they prepared for the battle to come. He kept his word, standing between her and the predatory world outside like an iron wall. Over the next 48 hours, he transformed from a quiet scrapper into a fierce advocate. He didn't let her return to the transit station, nor did he allow her to wander the industrial boulevard alone. Instead, he cleared the front cab of his flatbed truck, giving her a safe, lockable space to rest, while he kept watch over Unit 412 from a folding chair in the gravel alley. Using an old smartphone with a cracked screen, he spent hours making calls, leveraging the deep network of antique dealers, high-end salvage brokers, and estate professionals he had encountered over 20 years on the job. He knew who to trust, and, more importantly, he knew how to keep a secret. By the third morning, 2 vehicles arrived at the facility, bypassing the front office entirely after he had quietly paid off the manager to look the other way for one more day. Out of the first car, a modest hybrid, stepped a woman in a tailored tweed blazer. A leading historical preservationist from a prestigious Smithsonian-affiliated university. Out of the second, a black sedan, emerged a sharp-eyed estate attorney specializing in intellectual property and forgotten probate assets. Both experts looked deeply skeptical as they walked down the oil-stained alley, their eyes scanning the rusted iron plates piled outside the unit. But when she welcomed them inside, her spine straight and her posture radiating a quiet, calm authority, the atmosphere shifted. The evaluation took place under the glare of a pair of high-intensity halogen work lamps he had hooked up to a portable generator. The preservationist knelt before the open wooden crate, her hands clad in white cotton inspection gloves. She didn't speak for nearly an hour. She used a lighted magnifying visor to examine the serial numbers stamped into the titanium cylinders, then carefully unrolled the linen-backed blueprints across a clean plywood sheet he had laid out. With every passing minute, the woman's breath grew shallow. She traced the hand-inked white lines of the lunar navigation system, her eyes widening as she cross-referenced the technical annotations with a database on her tablet. When the preservationist finally stood up, she was visibly trembling. She turned to the attorney and then to her, her voice a hushed, reverent whisper. She confirmed that the prototypes were not only authentic, but they were also a complete, functional set of the legendary Apollo alternative designs, thought to have been destroyed during the federal laboratory sweeps of 1974. The engineering solutions present in the metallurgy alone were worth millions to modern aerospace firms, while the physical components were priceless artifacts of human exploration. The attorney immediately stepped into action, examining her certified letter and the original probate decree. He nodded once, a sharp, satisfied smile cutting across his face, confirming that her legal title to the contents of the unit was ironclad and indisputable. The verification shattered the quiet obscurity of the industrial district. Within 6 hours, the attorney had initiated a secure, private disclosure to a select circle of institutional buyers. By late afternoon, the dark alleyway outside Unit 412 became the epicenter of a silent, high-stakes financial war. Because the discovery was entirely undocumented on any modern registry, the acquisition had to be handled through confidential, fast-tracked bidding to prevent federal regulatory freezes or corporate injunctions. On one side of the digital table was a representative from a world-renowned National Aerospace Museum, desperate to secure the prototypes to serve as the crown jewel of their permanent space exploration gallery. On the other side was a private technological heritage foundation funded by a prominent Silicon Valley billionaire who wanted to acquire the lost engineering patents to study the physical synchronization mechanism for a new fleet of commercial satellites. He sat beside her on a pair of clean overturned buckets, his heavy shoulders squared, monitoring the incoming bids on the attorney's laptop. Every time a new offer flashed across the screen, escalating by hundreds of thousands of dollars, he would translate the legal jargon into plain English for her, ensuring nobody took advantage of her silence. The bidding escalated with a ruthless, professional intensity. The museum offered unparalleled historical prestige and a massive, tax-exempt cash settlement. But the private foundation possessed the agility of infinite capital. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the corrugated steel walls of the storage yard in shades of deep amber and gold, the final numbers materialized on the screen. The private foundation launched a definitive, non-contingent closing bid that guaranteed her immediate financial independence, while simultaneously agreeing to permanently lease the physical components back to the museum for public display. It was a flawless resolution. She sat in the dim light of the vault, listening to the soft murmur of the attorney finalizing the wire transfer protocols, realization finally washing over her. The invisible woman on the transit bench had just become the architect of her own fortune. The morning sun no longer wore the hostile, bruising gray of the transit terminal. Instead, it broke across the wide wooden planks of the wraparound porch in a warm, honey-colored flood, scattering the shadows of the old oak trees onto the manicured grass below. She sat in a high-backed wicker rocking chair, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her fingers were healed now, the dark smudges of rust and dried blood replaced by smooth, clean skin, though the faint white scars across her palms remained as permanent badges of honor. She wore a soft, cream-colored cardigan that kept the autumn chill at bay. Beside her chair sat a small ceramic table holding a steaming mug of fresh coffee and a morning newspaper she didn't care to read. She didn't need the news anymore. She finally had a life of her own to occupy her mind. The house was exactly what she had wanted. A modest, two-story craftsman cottage, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the gentler side of the county. It wasn't a mansion or a walled estate. She had refused the sprawling luxury properties the financial managers had pushed on her after the wire transfers cleared. To someone who had spent 3 years measuring survival in 12-hour increments, excess felt like a different kind of trap. She wanted permanence, thick walls that didn't rattle when the wind blew, and a deadbolt key that belonged to nobody else on earth. The deed inside her oak desk bore her name alone, an ironclad title to a piece of America that could never be repossessed or signed away. Yet, as she looked through the pristine glass of her front window into the warm living room, she knew the money was only the architecture of her peace. The true victory, the thing that had finally stilled the exhausting 70-year-old tremor in her soul, was the preservation of the name. A week ago, she had attended the private unveiling ceremony at the National Aerospace Museum's new gallery. There, under the gleaming glass display cases, sat the flawless titanium cylinders, and the beautiful, intricate silver-white navigation components she had pulled from the darkness. Beside the exhibit, etched in deep, elegant brass lettering on the wall, was a permanent plaque bearing her relative's full name, dedicating the collection to the rogue engineer who had saved history from the furnace. Her family was no longer a collection of forgotten names in a welfare ledger. They were part of the nation's foundation. The low, familiar rumble of an engine broke the quiet of the morning lane. She smiled, her eyes brightening as a familiar, freshly painted blue flatbed truck pulled up to the curb. The engine cut out with a smooth, satisfied purr, its mechanical components tuned to perfection. The door swung open, and he stepped out onto the asphalt. He had traded his grease-stained baseball cap for a clean one, but he still wore his heavy steel-toed boots and a crisp flannel shirt, his thick forearms corded with the familiar strength that had pried open her destiny. He carried a brown paper grocery bag tucked under one arm. He walked up the gravel path, his boots making a rhythmic, grounding sound that brought a wave of absolute comfort to her chest. He didn't climb the porch steps with the hesitance of a visitor. He walked up with the easy, familiar stride of a man who belonged there. He placed the grocery bag on the wicker table, revealing a half-dozen fresh pastries from the bakery down the boulevard, still warm enough to fog the paper wrapper. He pulled up the matching rocking chair beside her, sinking his massive frame into the cushions with a contented sigh. They didn't speak immediately. Their partnership had been forged in the silent, suffocating dust of Unit 412, and they had never needed many words to understand each other. He took a long sip from the mug she had already prepared for him, his eyes scanning the quiet street before settling on her with a look of protective, enduring pride. He had refused to take a single dollar of her inheritance, rejecting her offers of a partnership split with a fierce, stubborn shake of his head. He was a scrapper, he had told her, and a scrapper only took what he earned with his hands. But he had allowed her to buy him the new truck, a reliable tool for his trade, and he had accepted something far more valuable, her absolute trust, and an open door at the end of every hard day. The autumn wind rustled through the oak leaves, dropping a single golden leaf onto the porch floor. She looked at him, then looked back out at her quiet yard, the steady rocking of their chairs creating a soothing, synchronized rhythm against the wood. The transit station, the canvas bags, the cold benches, and the terror of the midnight sweeps were gone, fading into the distance like a bad dream at daybreak. They were bound together now, not by the wealth that filled her bank account, but by the memory of the heavy iron they had moved together, the secret they had unearthed, and the priceless, beautiful fortune they had pulled from the dust of a forgotten life.